Okay, I'd like to talk a little about the history and the styles of flamenco guitar. Originally, the guitar was strictly for accompanying, mainly singing and dancing, mainly singing probably. So the techniques were quite basic. Mostly you would be using the thumb and the index finger for melodies, working a lot with the bass strings for the melodies. And you would have basic rasgueado, where you would just be going like this, or just downstrokes, or brushing like this. And your golpes, your taps, which is with the, generally done with the ring finger. And that would be it. And then you would just be accompanying, following the tones of the singers. And that was the original flamenco guitar up until probably around the 1920s or 30s, when people were mainly in Madrid. A guitarist, Ramon Montoya, who is the uncle of Carlos Montoya, who later became a famous solo guitar player based in New York City, and toured around the world until he was about, I think, 92 or 94, something like that. I actually played for his niece, Carlos Montoya's niece, Rosa Montoya, in San Francisco for a while. Ramon Montoya was listening to some classical guitarists like Tárrega, and began to incorporate classical guitar techniques into the flamenco guitar, such as picado. Picado is using these two fingers to play melodies, alternating. You would also use arpeggios, having the fingers play notes sequentially like that. You would also use a tremolo, which is the sound of, kind of sounds like a mandolin. Various classical guitar techniques that hadn't been used before. And he was also probably the first actual soloist, would do flamenco guitar solos on stage and recording. Before him, it was strictly accompaniment. And you had various styles from different parts of Spain. You had, for example, Jerez Style, which came from, basically from a guitarist called Javier Molina from Jerez, who was the guitarist for Chacón and many, many other great singers. After him, there was Rafael El Águila, who taught many of the guitarists who became famous mainstay guitarists from Jerez during the 60s and 70s. They were taught by Rafael El Águila, many of them. And then you had the styles from Sevilla, such as Niño Ricardo, who was a great influence on most of the guitarists in Sevilla. And you had Melchor de Marchena, who was also a great influence on the guitarists from the Sevilla region, accompanied Antonio Mairena a lot, famous singers, Caracol. And then you had in Moron, another school that was started, maybe the beginning of it was a guitarist called Pepe Naranjo, and then came the great, for me, my favorite guitarist was Diego del Gastor, who was a Rom or Gypsy guitarist that lived in Moron pretty much all his whole life with his family. He was a very independent-minded person who really, he didn't care too much about money or the commercial flamenco world. So most of his life, he's pretty much stayed around his town of Moron and mostly performed in private gatherings. And he had many offers to tour and so forth, but he turned them all down because he just didn't want to do that, be involved with the commercial world. But he evolved a style that we call Moron Style nowadays. And it's a very distinctive sound, very distinctive style. And that is based on the traditional way of just mostly with the thumb and index finger playing, not too much other techniques. The Jerez style, the traditional Jerez style out of Javier Molina was the same way. It was based on a lot of thumb, mostly thumb. Unlike the Madrid, what developed in Madrid was much more and used all the techniques a lot of the guitar a lot. in Moron, that style is being carried on, but not too much nowadays. Diego del Gastor, he had 4 nephews that carried on that style. And now he's got some great nephews that are still trying to carry on that style to some degree. After Paco de Lucia appeared, and he started introducing a lot of changes in the guitar, flamenco guitar, more harmony. He was influenced very much by jazz, bossa nova, this sort of thing, and changed the sound, the sound of the guitar quite a bit. Plus, he raised the technical level to an incredible high degree of technique. And most of the people, since he appeared, like in the late 60s, early 70s, since that time, most of the guitarists started going towards his style. Like I said, like the way they hold the guitar this way, that came from Paco, instead of holding it this way, which Diego del Gastor would have held the guitar, or Javier Molina would have held the guitar like this. Paco introduced all kinds of new techniques. He introduced, started using a cajon when he started having a group. He introduced the cajon, the rhythm box from South America. The style became much more sophisticated, much more musical, and much more flashy technique. But to me, in my opinion, that style loses somewhat emotion to some degree. Where the older guitar, someone like Diego del Gastor or someone like Paco de Lucia, they could just hit one note very sparsely, placed notes. Single note would have a lot of weight and a lot of emotion. Whereas the modern style, it's going by very quickly, very dazzling technique, very impressive, but to me, lacking the feeling of the old style of guitar playing. I tend to be a little bit of an old style purist myself. I've always played basically the style where you're using your thumb and index a lot. So that's just a little bit about the history of the flamenco style.